in my days, I won't even say as a would-be poet, but I'll say as an unpublished poet, right? That, there is some of the same process that goes on. You're looking at something, and poetry also makes things in some ways very abstract. You really pare it down.
In this week's episode of the Mixtape with Scott, I had the great pleasure to talk with Rajeev Dehejia, a professor and economist at New York University. This was my first time to talk to Rajeev, but I feel like I've known him for a long time because of how many times I've read, studied, and taught two of his papers, co-authored with an old classmate, Wahba, which used propensity scores to revisit an old famous article written in 1986 by Bob Malone. Bob's paper and Rajeev's papers too sort of play, in my mind, these central roles in the evolution of the credibility revolution, running from Princeton's industrial relations section, from Orley Ashenfelter and David Card, both who advised Bob Malone, through Josh Angrist, his classmate, who graduated, went to Harvard, met Guido Imbens and Don Rubin, and worked on their 1990s work on instrumental variables. Rajeev, though, was a student in the economics department at Harvard in the early to mid 1990s, which was also when Imbens and Angrist were there. And one year, Imbens organized a new class on causal inference that he co-taught with Don Rubin from the stats department, and Rajeev took it along with Wahba. This interview helps add just a few more colorful details to that broader story. But that's just a skeleton that sort of helps give justification for why I reach out to certain people. This is primarily an interview with a real person, a real interesting economist, Rajeev Dehejia, who shares with me his own story, his own passions, his loves about economics and empiricism, and what drew him into economics and why he stays. He is someone who finds life beautiful and finds in economics beauty. And I hope you find this interview to be as much fun and as fascinating to listen to as I did. Thanks for turning into my mixtape. I'm Scott Cunningham, the host. Okay, well, this is a genuine, it's always an honor to talk to anybody on the podcast. It is a particularly unique feeling to get to speak, to get to interview today my guest, Rajeev Dehejia, but I don't know if I said that correctly, so I'm almost positive I didn't.
That's pretty good, though. It's Rajeev Dehejia.
Rajeev, can you, for the sake of the reader, the listener, tell us again your name and what you do for a living?
Of course. My name is Rajeev Dehejia. I'm a professor of economics and public policy at New York University. And in my own work, I call myself a poor man's econometrician sometimes, but that really means I'm interested in applied microeconomic topics, but with an interest in methodological questions. And so I like to solve practical problems. I like to actually look at very applied questions, but from time to time, I like to pivot back and forth and take a step up and think, what's the underlying methodological question here? Is there something that we can say that would be helpful to a broad set of applied readers and researchers?
I'm teaching this history of economic thought class right now, and I'm learning about Adam Smith. I didn't know anything about him before, except for stuff you could put on a bumper sticker. And the things that I did not know was all of what he did, all of his economics really seemed to come at the service of he was interested in public policy. Were you always like that? Were you always somebody that was kind of interested in, does your interest in methodology come from an overall interest in something bigger than that?
That's a great question. And since we're going to speak candidly, the candid answer is actually no. Going back to the beginning, not really. I think what drew me into the world that I'm in now originally was some sort of intellectual pleasure. I just found some things really interesting, and I found the pursuit of ideas intoxicating and interesting and exciting. I thought, wow, this would be an amazing way to spend one's life. Right. Early on, I was probably uncertain or even agnostic to some extent. Well, what could that be? There was you're in college, you're studying many things. It could be just about anything at that point, right? And so as I progressed and I've latched onto economics, I was a graduate student, then I was an assistant professor, I do sort of recall a specific moment in my mind when I was an assistant professor, which sort of made me pivot a little bit toward an interest in public policy or sort of applied problems that can actually, however indirectly, be of benefit to society. And so, yeah, I was an assistant professor on tenure track at Columbia. As you know, tenure track anywhere is a particularly stressful activity, but particularly at some universities, especially Columbia in those days, there was sort of a sense that it's not really going to happen. And so you need to be set to hit the market at the end of your tenure track and really present yourself well, so you can get the job that will offer you tenure. And so if that's your goal, of course, you should be, as you would advise your students or as I advise mine, right? There's strategies you should follow to do that. But in the middle of this, when I was sort of trying to be sort of, to take care of my career, someone came to me with a project that involved something in the real world that seemed to be immensely important. It was a large project funded by many people, sort of dealing with the public health issue. And I thought, wow, that would be such an interesting thing to work on, because if I work on that, and it's even slightly useful, there's just even a slightly useful piece of information or knowledge that comes out of that, what a potential benefit it could be. At the same time, the practical part in me as an assistant professor trying to get tenure said, but this project could be a bottomless pit of effort that leads to no publications that help me in my academic career.
Right.
And so I ultimately, this story does not, I don't. The story shows me perhaps in my practical sense, I actually declined to participate in that. But this stayed in my mind, saying, look, if we're doing these things, it's important to pursue ideas that we find interesting, to pursue intellectual curiosity. But I think it's also important to do things that have the hope, at least, of helping people. And I say that with all the modesty of an academic, and that too of an academic who does things that are sometimes abstract, right?
Yeah.
And that led me to not only have this sort of methodological strand of my work, but also add on applied strands of my work, saying, okay, let me directly tackle, to the best of my ability, problems that I find interesting and that I think are important. So
Yeah.
Sometime around then, I began doing a set of papers on child labor that sort of took me in some percent, I don't know whether it's 50% by now, or in some significant proportion, toward being a development economist. I thought, this is an area where some of the tools that I've been using, some of the skills I have, some of the questions that interest me crop up, but they crop up in a way that has this huge potential impact on the well-being of a large number of people.
Yeah. Yeah. But I can see on your wall, listeners can't see this, but you have all this beautiful artwork on your wall. And you said that you were originally someone who was kind of like just sort of drawn to things that were just intellectually interesting. Is it sort of part of your background that you sort of have a, is that connected? This because I think about the art, I think about a love of beauty. Lots of times art appreciation is kind of almost hedonistic. You just love how it feels to look at something. And economics itself has always had that feel for me too, of just being intrinsically beautiful. Are you that kind of person though?
That's an excellent question, and it's very perceptive, because I think the answer is yes, and to sort of validate the cliche in some ways, in terms of children fulfilling the dreams of their parents. My father is a medical doctor, so is my mother. But my father always had a great ambition to be to make an intellectual contribution to his areas of interest, which are nothing near economics. But I think from him, I did pick up that love of beauty. In fact, it turns out that his area of study is sort of the philosophy of art, and so aesthetic theory, right? And so very directly relating to the question of beauty and what is beauty.
Yeah.
But also just the pleasure of ideas. And with it, one additional pleasure, which unfortunately does not always come out in our own world of academic writing, is the pleasure of words.
Yeah.
Which is, how you actually express that idea.
Right.
And I'll be honest to say, and I know I'm pretty sure you've experienced this as well, that as we become better academic writers, we're writing papers for journals, we're writing with co-authors, it does sort of smooth out or sand down the idiosyncrasies of our style a little bit. But
Yeah.
when you read a well-written paper, and there are well-written papers out there, you just say, oh yeah, that's lovely, because you're saying something, but
Yeah.
you're saying it clearly, but you're saying it in a way that's actually interesting and engaging. So yes, all of these have been sort of part of what motivated me at the very beginning. And of course, that could have led in many directions. I'm delighted it led in the way that it did. But yeah, there were sort of many branching off points.
Yeah.
Even within economics, when I was a graduate student, first, second year graduate student, I actually was uncertain whether I would pursue a dissertation in microtheory or in econometrics, right? So those were my two fields when I was at Harvard. You sort of had to declare two fields. And my two fields were microtheory. So Andrea Mascole was my sort of putative advisor if I had gone in that direction.
Yeah.
And the other was sort of econometrics. That was Gary Chamberlain and Guido Imbens, right? And so I was sort of, for a while, I was pursuing them both because I found them both incredibly interesting. But I also did love some of the pure intellectual and abstract pleasure of the microtheory side of it. As it turns out, I was not a good microtheorist. I'm glad I discovered that early in life. And I'm also glad I count my great fortune being at a place where we were sort of allowed to explore our intellectual interests. So Harvard as a doctoral program was sort of the place where you were sort of left to pursue what you thought was interesting.
Yeah.
And so I was briefly in this schizophrenic situation of pursuing two very different things.
Yeah.
But I did it long enough to discover, yes, I do love them both, but I'm better at one than the other, right? And I'm glad I got a chance to do that.
Yeah.
Otherwise I might have just been a not very good microtheorist sitting somewhere in the world. And instead I had the good fortune of getting to do what I've done. And so I think that's a very perceptive observation.
What were you like as a kid? What on that topic about, what I have noticed as a kid that you were drawn to life of the mind or beauty or things like that?
This is an interesting question. I don't have a very clear answer. I'll give you two contradictory answers. And one of them is, maybe both of them in some ways are inspired by observing my own son, which I think is the closest I can get to imagining what I would have been like when I was 5 or 8 or 9, beyond my own recollections, which are of course, one-sided and faulty. I do remember that when I was fairly young, 5, 6, 7, somewhere around that age, there was one of the nurses at my pediatrician's office or something. You used to call me the professor. And I remember that. I don't know why she called me that, but there must have been some reason, right? So that kind of pushes in the direction of saying, well, yes, maybe I was always a little bit like this. At the same time, I sort of remember myself, at least in those early years, as being fundamentally a happy-go-lucky person, not necessarily setting myself up, at least at that time, which is perhaps not unreasonable if you're 7 or 8, or sort of diving deeply into things. And so, maybe I had a bit of both in me at that time.
So you grew up, did you grow up in Canada?
That is right, in Ottawa, Canada.
Okay. And so Carleton, you end up, what was your, in high school, before we get to Carleton, in high school, what did you think you could imagine, or did you sort of hope your future would be like? The kinds of things you did, were you thinking maybe I might be a doctor, or did you have other aspirations?
That's a good question. And I would say that pretty much fairly early on in high school, I think I zeroed in on the notion of pursuing graduate school and not becoming a medical doctor, to my disappointment. I think part of it, since we are talking about sort of background, like, and early life, which is, it's always fun to find somebody who's going to indulge you in these conversations. I think it's sort of important to note in this that my brother is also an economist. He also did PhD in economics, right? And so, the empiricist in us will have to ask, could this be a correlated event?
Oh, I'm gonna Google it. Wait, who's your brother?
His name is Vivek Dehejia. He's actually now, he did his PhD at Columbia, and now he is a professor at Carleton University, where we both went to college.
Oh, no way.
And so, I think
is he a younger brother or an older brother?
He's an older brother, exactly.
He's older.
He's older, right? And so, in some ways, I would sort of say that the set of forces that led us down this path were sort of highly correlated, right? That in some ways, in a very direct way, actually, right? I learned because he was a couple of years ahead of me. We also had a very good high school economics teacher, right? A charismatic and somewhat mysterious man, right? It's sometimes hard to know what he was saying, but he was passionate, he was knowledgeable, and he really kind of gripped you. And so, having had the benefit of somebody whose interests ultimately, we're our interests are similar. We're sort of working our way through. You learn from those around you, right? And so I sort of had this pathway of learning about economics, and so I think that the fact that we were both going through this, me with a 2-year lag, like is one of the important explanations for how I ended up down this path.
So you go to Carleton, and are you thinking at Carleton immediately? So, I mean, it sounds like economics is kind of like in your head way before college, but is that true?
That is true. By the time I arrived at Carleton University, I already knew I wanted to do economics. That is not so unusual in the Canadian system, which really requires you to take, similar to the British system, it requires you to take at least half, if not more, of your courses within your major. So it's actually really hard if you really sort of have to decide in your first year, or you have to give yourself a couple of options in your first year and then really narrow down in your second year. But I already knew by the time I had joined that was a path that I was going to pursue.
What did you find so interesting about economics as a young person? That early kind of spark that you thought given somebody that loves beautiful thoughts, what was it about economics?
So economics offered an intellectually elegant way to explain human behavior and phenomena that we observe in the world that to someone else might seem sort of messy, right? And of course, messiness can also be interesting, but it's a question of how do you approach that? And the fact that economics was trying to organize, sort of to try to explain this behavior in an organized way through a systematic set of models and assumptions was very appealing, right? It sort of tried to take the seeming chaos and say, well, yes, there is, as we know in our world, there is randomness out there. There's an epsilon, but underneath all these epsilons, there is, or there could be a structure that could explain a lot of what we see, or at least a big chunk of it. And let's try to push that thinking further. Is that model the right one or not? And I think, as is true for many people who study economics, particularly of a certain generation, when we started studying economics, there was, of course, a much greater emphasis early on. It was front-loaded with sort of the conceptual frameworks, right? I mean, I don't want to say theory, because as an undergrad, you're not really doing heavy-duty math, but it was very sort of theoretically motivated. And it's only later, I would say, really ultimately in graduate school, where I got to sort of taste the second half of it. And I think that, there are many new approaches to teaching economics, new principles books out there these days. And what I appreciate about some of these new approaches is that it puts the evidence, the empirical part, sort of up front, right at the front, saying, look, yes, we have all these frameworks. It is part of what makes us economists. We don't want to ignore them. We don't want to downplay them, right? We're not just data scientists or statisticians. Those are great fields to be, but we're not. We happen to be economists. And so here's a way that we look at the world.
Right.
But right away, we have to say, look, yes, there are these theories and assumptions. But, a lot of people like me spend many years of undergrad saying, yeah, but these assumptions don't seem right, do they? We know that's true, not true. Right. And of course, we know that. And you have all these empiricists out there sort of trying to match the theory we have with the data and trying to push both of them forward. And so I think that not atypical for many undergraduate college majors from the late 20th century, if I can call it that, right? That's how we were taught. I guess I was lucky sort of in graduate school to be able to discover the other side of it, right? If I sort of stayed with that initial motivation and excitement of the beginning, I would have gone down that micro theory path, which I did find incredibly appealing. But I had the good fortune of sort of discovering the other side of it, which eventually came to to
It was
be.
more the pure theory. It was like, like pure micro theory. It wasn't like Gary Becker, like
No,
creating models of behavior. It was like
it,
pure
it was,
theory.
yes, it was pure theory, unrealized, an unrealized aspiration, So maybe
Mm,
if what I said of my father with respect to me is true, then maybe my son will grow up to be a micro theorist. Who knows?
yeah, right.
Or maybe he'll be a mathematician or something
Yeah,
even more abstract. Who knows?
yeah. Well, so when you graduated from Carleton, when did you say to yourself, I think I want, when did you actually start saying to yourself, not, I just want to study economics, I want to be an economist? Is that something that happened in your life? Like that kind of like resolution almost?
It happened, but it happened in a way that was so um, implicit and complete that I couldn't even point to a revelation, right? That
Mm,
by the time, since my brother and I are both economists, we're kind of moving along in parallel, right? And by the time
right.
I joined, he was already in his third year. He hadn't applied for graduate schools or anything like that, right? But he was sort of thinking about it. And by the time I came in, I thought, yeah, this seems like a really good path for me as well. I'm interested in these questions as well. My
Mm,
own skills seem well suited to it. And so, if it's interesting and you think you can do it, and then why not, right? But it's true that, yeah, there wasn't a moment where, let's say, like, midway through college, I said, oh yeah, I should really apply for a PhD. I think I was pretty clear from early on. I just assumed it, and it just happened that way.
mm. Well, you say the skills. What were you noticing about yourself, like as you were kind of interacting with this degree?
So, without overstate it, I was certainly good at math, right? So I loved math. And I loved, which also overlaps with economics, that ability to think in abstraction, right?
Yeah.
To sort of take a step away from the thing that you're looking at, um, pare it down to its essentials, and present an abstract vision of that.
Mm-hmm.
That same, going back to something that you were saying or asking about earlier, I think that same mindset is actually also can lead to some very different things. So, for example, one of the things I was very interested in for many years was writing, by which I mean fiction, poetry, things like
Yeah.
that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, in my days, I won't even say as a would-be poet, but I'll say as an unpublished poet, right? That,
Mm-hmm.
there is some of the same process that goes on. You're looking at something, and poetry also makes things in some ways very abstract. You really pare it down, right? And you're just looking for these kind of essential lines that you can convey powerful and complex ideas in a very pared down, but in some ways clarifying kind of way, right? And so I think those impulses are very much related.
Mm.
Uh, I I have a friend from graduate school, Kei Hirano, who's famous for his economics haikus. So I unfortunately
Oh yeah.
cannot claim that I used my poetry talents anywhere within economics. He has managed to do so, for which I have to greatly admire his accomplishments.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. So you graduate and you're looking at possible schools. I know it's not a hard decision if you're accepted into Harvard to go to Harvard, but what did you know about what did you know when you were applying, that might, were you someone who is like, I want to be, so let me back up. I think a lot of I meet a lot of students, they're like, I want to study with this person. And then they'll like apply to go study with that person.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then but I always kind of think, you don't really know yet what you want, like even it's not to even belittle that those important experiences that you're having in college at all. It's just that, it's just really hard to predict what you will fall in love with in
Yes.
grad school. And that might itself not even persist. So I was just kind of curious, what were you thinking before Harvard that might be your interests?
So when I was applying, and this will really show me somebody who had no idea what he wanted to do. On my actual graduate school application, I was kind of pitching myself as somebody interested in macroeconomics.
Mm,
Uh, And but very close to what you were saying, right? I was aware, right? So, a couple of years earlier, my brother had been through the same process,
Yeah.
ended up at Columbia. And, in his case, he was interested in sort of trade and development. And so this was a very natural place for him to end up.
Right.
But I sort of, I learned a lot, right? So that, he'd had we sort of essentially doubled up, but, really through him, I had the benefit of some of the conversations that he'd had prior to going to different graduate schools. And from that, I really said to myself, well, okay, if I get into either Harvard or MIT, I should go to one of those two because it's Cambridge, Mass, and you sort of have the benefit of both,
right,
to some extent.
Yeah.
And I have to say that while that is true, right? So, for example, I was very lucky to have Josh Angrist as he was not one of my thesis advisors in an official sense, but in every practical sense, I was very lucky to have him as an advisor. Like, what an amazing thing, right? I was at Harvard, I could go to MIT and I could talk to him.
He was not at Harvard at the time, because I know he started out there, but I don't know exactly.
That's right. He crossed over. He was at MIT by that time.
He goes Harvard. Does he go Harvard, Hebrew, MIT, or something like that? I see. Okay.
Yeah. And so by that time he was at MIT, but that's two T stops away, and it was really helpful to have him around. And so in that was what I'm sort of saying here is that from that sort of T0 of graduate school application, where I said, okay, yes, one of these has surely got to be better than anything else.
Right.
I think that part was borne out. Something that I didn't realize, and that I always talk to prospective graduate students about, and I think they're just much better informed maybe than I certainly was, but I might even suspect it's an entire generational shift in how well people are informed, right? That I knew the faculty members at different places, right? So I could say, okay, these are the people. I knew a little bit about their work. I could look up their work, but I didn't know a lot about the culture of different places, right? That Harvard and MIT are both amazing places, but they have very different cultures. And there I was not very informed, right? I sort of said, okay, which one? I wasn't sure, right? And I don't know if I could even give you a clear answer as to why I tipped toward Harvard rather than MIT.
Well, so back then in the 90s, what would make a student thrive in one but not the other?
Right. So, I think that it's back to what I was saying about my experience at Harvard, which I think ultimately was successful, but might not have been, in the sense that a little bit, as I'm sort of being honest about, that I was interested in many things, probably too many. I was a little bit slow to sort of pare down those interests. It took me a while to focus and really, home in on what I was interested in. And in that context, right, I suppose in a place where I was being sort of more closely advised, or there was an advisor hovering right over me, somebody would have said at some point, okay, look, it's year 3. You can't just hang on to two completely unrelated sets of things. You can't say you might be a theorist, you might be doing econometrics. Somebody would have said that to me. Nobody said that to me, which I think it worked out just fine. I think in part,
but it could have not.
It might not have, right? I think I was extremely lucky in some ways, and I think that in another context, probably at MIT, somebody would have taken me aside much earlier and sort of said, okay, look, this is the sequence of things, right? And working backwards, you cannot be. You need to be at another point. You didn't narrow this down. You cannot have 2 or 3 topics that are completely unrelated. You need to really be doing something. And so I think for me, it did work out very well for the reason I've just mentioned, that I was somebody who did take time to sort of triangulate, or maybe even wander is a more honest word, from topic to topic until I really found a vein of questions that interested me and that eventually sort of became the broader set of things that I do now, right? So it kind of narrows down, then broadens out. The other reason why it worked very well for me was, Harvard was the kind of place where everybody is willing to talk to you, but you need to find them, right? So finding them physically is not hard. They're in their office, but they're not going to come and seek you out. That's fair enough. But if you make the effort of going to speak with people, they're there, and there's just so many people who are available and willing to talk to you, right? So I was a graduate student in economics, so of course, at some point I was kind of narrowing down. I had Gary Chamberlain, Guido Imbens, but when my topic crossed over to something else, I went to talk to Amartya Sen. I of course had also as advisors Larry Katz, Caroline Hawksby. There was sort of, because I was doing work that was kind of at this cusp between econometrics and applied stuff. And so, I had them as well. And so you could always talk to people, and they were always willing to speak with you. The notion that, they wouldn't speak to you or be constructive just didn't really exist. Of course, you had to take the initiative, and you had to sort of be ready for that conversation, which I think is completely fair.
Yeah.
In the same spirit, another advisor in all but formality was Don Rubin, right? At least for 2/3 of my dissertation, basically, right? And so, in that sense, I wasn't the one that made the contact, but in some ways, Hido, as an assistant professor, was the one who sort of followed that same kind of spirit, saying like, hey, we're working on this topic. We have this guy, Don Rubin, sitting in the stats department. Why don't I go and talk to him, right? And so, in a similar spirit, when I was a graduate student, of course, I spoke to Rubin because I'd taken his joint course with Hido. But then,
they taught a class together?
They did. I can tell you a little bit more about that. But in the same spirit, just to close out that thought, right? I went and sought out other people. I went and sought out other statisticians. I went, I by that time I had a topic, so I knew what I was interested in, right? So
what was the topics? What were you narrowing down on?
I had basically two things by that point, right? So I had the work which eventually became the propensity score work with my graduate school friend and colleague Sadek Wahba, and then I had what eventually became, what we call in our role the job market paper. The sort of the other paper in my dissertation was on program evaluation as a decision problem, basically using sort of Bayesian tools to think about the classic program evaluation problem. Right? And so that led me actually to lots of places, because the Bayesian part, of course, there's Don Rubin, but there was Carl Morris, there's other statisticians around Harvard that were speaking to, and then of course the decision theory part. It's not that I was doing anything terribly sophisticated.
Where did you publish that paper?
That paper came out in the Journal of Econometrics in 2005. It had a kind of record for the longest delay between inception and publication until I broke that record recently by a wide margin. But so that paper got accepted actually much earlier than that, but it was part of, had the opportunity to put it in a volume of other papers that are going to be touching on program evaluation topics.
Yeah.
I said, yeah, that sounds great. Little did I know then that there is a plus and a minus, because sometimes those volumes that have many papers, they get slowed down because all the papers have to come in before you can put it out, right?
Yeah.
That is why it had that a late publication date of 2005. I don't remember when it was accepted, but it would have been.
That's a great dissertation. Those three things. So that's your JASA, your restat, and that kind of hang together really beautifully.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for saying so. I mean, I do think that I do think that those ideas were in the air, right? So I mean, I appreciate the appreciation, but at the same time, I sort of think that a bit like other fields, you're trying to be creative, you're trying to be original, but you're also part of a current or a trend. Things are in the air, and you're sort of trying to pluck them from the air and sort of put something together. And in terms of the second paper, right, this was something that involved Gary Chamberlain as much as Hido Imbens, even more so because Hido himself was transitioning out of Harvard by that time, right? So, but also in terms of Gary Chamberlain, one of the great econometricians, had sort of taken a Bayesian turn by that point, and that itself, right, is related to this confluence of Imbens and Rubin. And so by the time there's this interesting transition. So when I took Gary Chamberlain's sort of graduate econometrics course, it was not Bayesian. It's kind of classic panel data. Gary Chamberlain, like you imagine his handbook panel data article, it's kind of that vintage of Gary Chamberlain in some ways.
Yeah. And
it was either the next year or 2 years later, I'm going to say, that he completely redid the course and it became sort of Bayesian. And so I remember, and this was not uncommon with Gary Chamberlain, people would often sit in on his course a second time because he was such a clear but also very far thinking and terse communicator, right? Like he just said what needed to be said and nothing more.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And part of that meant that sometimes he would be 17 steps ahead of you, right? And so you're like, oh, okay. And when you took his course the first time, yes, you get something, but you would often sit in. I was not the only one who sit in a second time. And oh, okay, second time
Oh,
around.
it'd be
I already
yeah,
know
because
the
it's like a different class because he's evolving.
exactly. But even for the stuff that you think you knew,
Yeah.
when you sort of already, and that's sort of, ultimately, a great compliment to Gary, which is that, for the people that already know the material in some ways, right? You're kind of already basically there. His insights were so clarifying.
Mm,
Just make it so clear in a way that was incomparable.
mm. When did you first learn about that Lalonde 1986 American Economic Review article? When do you remember the first time you read it?
So, Scott, you were asking me about where I first heard about the Lalonde paper.
Yeah. So when did you first hear that paper? What was the context?
So this goes back to 1993,
Mm,
which was I was a second-year graduate student, and that was the first year that Hito Imbens and Don Rubin were teaching a joint course together. So it would have been maybe spring 1994.
mm,
And so it was this, jointly taught classes are unfortunately quite rare, but when they come together, it's an amazing kind of combination, right? Because you have two different personalities, two different disciplines, and it's kind of like watching two jazz musicians, riff or
right.
whatever, but they're different styles, and it's really cool. But anyway, one of the sort of entry points of their course was the Lalonde 1986 paper, right? Saying, here was this classic paper talking about how you really, our econometric methods just were not cutting it for this basic problem, and that is where I first saw this paper.
So what do you think? I mean, was it presented, you know, sometimes I've heard people say, well, this was a very impactful paper because it cast a lot of doubt and about estimation. And it sort of fits into this larger narrative that now is like the rise of the credibility revolution. It's kind of like part of that story. But what was it? What was the story then?
Right. So the way that the story came to us then, and by us, I mean really myself and Sadek Wahba, my friend from graduate school, we were in that class together, was to say, okay, you have Lalonde here, and his conclusion was incredibly influential, but a lot has happened since he wrote his paper, and now, what if we approached his question with a slightly more contemporary perspective? Would we reach the same conclusion, right? And so that was the sort of the genesis of approaching Robert Lalonde and actually asking if we could borrow his original data tapes from that paper. And when he had written it, we're talking about data tapes, right? So in fact, there were data tapes that came to us. And it has to be said, I only met, I think, Robert Lalonde 2 or 3 times in my career.
Yeah.
But he was an incredible guy just based on those interactions. I know other people that know him much better, and so I know that's true.
Yeah.
But I still marvel at the fact that as graduate students, second year doctoral students, we write to them saying, like, hey, can we have your data? Right now, today that's become much more common, and I think it's great that it is much more common, right? That we put our data out there to begin with,
right?
And if it isn't there, then people write to us, and that's a very standard question, as it should be. But in those days, it wasn't that common, right? And he said, sure. He sent over his tapes, right? And so I think that it was.
That's a big deal. I mean,
yeah,
it's like if it's tape. What are tapes? What is that exactly? This is like, these are not floppy disks. What are they?
I don't know if you've seen like 1960s science fiction, like these big, thick.
like movie camera looking things, like film.
Yeah, but it was like this. It's kind of thick magnetic.
Yeah. So he's got all that in his office. Like he's just like he's kept it.
He's kept it. Yeah, and
this is the thing, right? Like it's a big part of your study how many pre-treatment years you're going to pull in. So did you already know that before going in? You were like, we want more.
We did not. So that came from once we got into it, we sort of realized there was this issue that for some of the units you had 2 years of pre-treatments, for some you did not, right? And so since that whole exercise was trying to think about, in this application, how far can you get with the observables, right? So that's the question, right? In Malone's world, things have not gone so well. We said, okay, we're going to try to clarify this by using, in our case, propensity score methods.
Yeah. And that's what, and from that class with Rubin, it was like, I mean, could you have gone other routes? Like, I mean, matching and all these things. I never quite know what the entire, horizon would have been. You do propensity scores, you do the stratification and all these options, but was there like on the table, you could do all these things? I mean, you got this whole class that you're doing with Rubin. You could have done all.
That's a good question. I suppose we could have gone the Bayes route as well, because there's a lot of Bayes that we were doing in that class as well. But we did not, because in some sense, it really seemed as though, it's what I sort of tell my students, is the missing table in the Lalonde paper.
Oh, that's interesting.
By which I'm not implicating Lalonde himself. It's missing from his paper because almost every paper of that generation or before a certain point in time looked like that, right? In today's paper, it's so universal that we're used to seeing it, right? You look for table 1 or table 2, it's going to be descriptive statistics of the whole sample, broken down by treatment and control group.
Yes.
Right. But you see, that mentality that we have, that notion that, okay, this is how we're thinking about it. And it's kind of obvious that you must compare these. It doesn't matter. It can even be an experiment. We're doing it there because we want to know that things are well balanced.
Yeah.
If it's not an experiment, even more so, right? We need that table to just begin our thought on what we should do. And so in many ways, I sort of think that, in sort of thinking about that paper, that work, that's one of the things I point out, right? In some ways, this is maybe even the most fundamental contribution, not of us, but of that sort of intellectual movement, right? That, bringing this kind of Rubin causal model approach into economics has clarified this one. You need that table. You need
the table because your target parameter is y1 minus y0. And you're going to be essentially imputing or, imputing a counterfactual from another group that's not that unit that is in the target parameter, which is counterfactual. So you need to start looking at how these guys are different from each other. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. That's exactly.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, because I mean, if you don't think that way, yeah, that's really interesting. If you don't think in terms of that, here's the two groups and we're going to be using one group as a counterfactual for the other, which it clearly isn't the counterfactual.
Yep.
Then, you don't have to make that table too.
Exactly.
Right.
And so that, back to your question, made it a very natural step to say, look, these observables are really different. That is sort of a call for saying, okay, observables looking really different. Maybe propensity score in one of its flavors can be the thing that tidies the situation up.
Yeah.
Right. So in some ways, I would say that that is the sort of the second piece of it, which is to say that once we knew that observables were important, then the question is, okay, do we have the observables that matter? Right. This assumption, conditional independence, it only makes sense when you believe, for whatever reason, that you have the covariance of matter.
Yeah.
And we were very right, and we were very keen to sort of explore that assumption. So sometimes our papers are sort of viewed or were interpreted ex post as sort of cheerleading for propensity score, right? And that's not in some ways an unfair interpretation, because we were saying, look, you use this method, it actually can work, right? But we were also saying that you use this method, it can work, but only if the assumption is valid. And here is a case where you can just point to it, saying, okay, if you don't have 2 years of data in our paper, we said, look, let's strip away 1 year of data. Suddenly doesn't work as well, right? And so there you have within the actual application the example of, yes, it can work if the assumption is valid in the context or application that you have, but if it isn't, then it's not going to work. And so I think that sometimes that cautionary second note that we did hit was sort of lost over the years. And, that's fine. If your paper is remembered, ultimately you don't care too much whether people get all the messages you're trying to tell.
Yeah.
But I do think that, whether from us or from sort of the literature just in general, I think we've reached a somewhat more balanced point on this, right? That, we sort of understand that, yes, there are situations in which a propensity score or matching or reweighting, these are really useful tools to have at your disposal. This is part of your arsenal.
Right.
You're going to use it. Sometimes it may be in complement to other things. Occasionally, it may be the identification approach you're using.
Yeah.
But sometimes it may be diagnostic, right? And I sometimes think of what we were doing, the initial steps, really shows that this is a really good diagnostic tool as well, right? How different do these observables look?
Yeah.
But then there may also be times when you say, no, look, it's just not, the data are not there,
right,
to sustain this approach, and then you should say so. So I always remember Rubin giving some examples. I've forgotten what it was. It's one of the projects he'd worked on at some point, where he sort of made this point that, by looking at the data and asking, basically he's talking about common support, what we now call common support, right? That when in looking at the data, he said, look, there just isn't common support. So, we can't answer this, but I'm not even going to try, right? And as researchers, we have that luxury, and I think we should use it, right? And so in my world, I teach doctoral students, but I also teach public policy students, right? So people who are going to go into a world where maybe they're not given that choice, right? You must come back with the best answer you have. And you don't have the luxury of saying, well, I can't do that, right? And so that's a slight difference between sort of the world of research and the world of sort of applied policy work, where you may not have that luxury. But it's important to remember, and even if you're not given that luxury, like, I want to know the best answer you can give me, at least in your mind, somewhere you can sort of make it clear, like, these are the qualifications or caveats to that. So I think it was an amazing moment to be a graduate student at Harvard. Now, maybe that's nostalgia, like everybody says that about when they were a graduate student, right? And that's fair enough. But in the specific sense that it was a moment where actually there are a lot of crossovers happening when I was a graduate student, right? So I talked about the fact that, I worked with Rubin and Hito were already working together in that class that we sat in, that we took in from their first joint class. There were both econ and statistics graduate students, right? It was kind of going both ways.
Yeah.
In my other field that I never pursued, I was theory, right? I was for a couple of years kind of sitting in on everything, right? And so that was a period in which, Leighton had just arrived at Harvard. Behavioral economics was beginning. There's kind of a behavioral economics reading group that I was a part of, in which we were sort of studying, psychology and economics, and Sandil Malainath had arrived as a graduate student, so he was in that group as well, right? And so there were all these things that were happening on that side as well, right? And so I think it was a very fruitful moment, and I think that in economics we have gotten really good at being able to borrow good ideas from other fields,
right?
And I think that in the case of my work, and that sort of movement, it clearly was this sort of marriage of sort of economics and statistics that I think gave something back to both fields, right? I think statistics, I think they've gotten something out of it as well. And of course, we're economists, so we're going to take those ideas and push them in our own direction, right? We're not just going to become statisticians, and that's fine. That's as it should be. But if you can walk away with a couple of good ideas, and if you look at economics, clearly there's some ideas that just completely change the way we think about things. Then that's an amazing outcome from a set of conversations that began in Hito's telling, like at the washing machines between Angrist and Imbens, when they were, I think Angrist was still visiting, I think maybe before I arrived, he was like a visiting professor at Harvard, right? And so conversations over the washing machine between these two guys eventually led them to pull in Rubin. And, I say, in all sort of accuracy, right? That changed the direction of my life as well. And I think that's always true. Life can always be told as kind of a logical plan or as a series of accidents. And I'm personally very comfortable seeing it in the latter way, that things happen, and you sort of hopefully are lucky enough or opportunistic enough or smart enough to kind of, yes, okay, let's it's here, let's just take it and run with it.
Yeah. It's funny, there's so many subtle things in those two papers that you wrote that I don't know if people fully absorb. One is just the diagnostic value of the propensity score to evaluate common support. How much different would Lalonde's paper have been if he had that one piece?
Exactly. I think it would have been completely different. Yeah. I mean, I think that, that diagnostic piece, just being able to say, okay, here's a histogram, and it just jumps out at you like, oh, 15,992 CPS comparison units. Mm-hmm. But only 15,000 or more of them are just not relevant, right?
Exactly. Right.
And, name a linear regression that existed in 1986, or even in 1994 when we were working on this, 95, that can solve that problem.
Right? Exactly. Right.
And so
I think like a lot of people, I think they see with propensity scores, they're like, I mean, there's a group of people that sort of see propensity scores as non-causal. They'll just like flat out say it. And, it's like, it's a long conversation. There's like, a bumper sticker kind of statement that I think you just have to pull that out. But the thing is, like, what I think people don't really realize is, first of all, just even being able to explore K dimensions of covariates is really, really hard to like explore that. Like just even like, you can't even visualize it. You don't even it's not easy to do, to try to think about common support concepts when you have 10 variables and just huge number of strata per variable. It's just it's not possible. Then you get it into this propensity score, and then you just do this histogram, and you're like, well, good Lord, like 10,000 of these observations in the CPS have a propensity score of point that of essentially zero.
Exactly.
They're like not anything like the people in this experiment. They're not even remotely they're not relevant. And but then the other thing, so that alone, I just kind of feel like, when people are wanting to go like, well, why don't I just run regressions? It's like, you just kind of want to go, okay, fine. There's a whole conversation, but I don't even think you really fully appreciate who is in your control group. You don't really quite, well, one, you don't even have the table 2 that we were describing. I mean, in a way, it's kind of like, this is even a part of that conversation you had a minute ago, which is like the missing table. How these groups are really different from each other, and just putting in controls is like, anyway, that was just.
Yeah, no, and that I'm not a deep student of the history of ideas, but I can say that in my life, and maybe in our times, we can credit some of this to the statistics part of the marriage of economics and statistics, right? This is very much a stats tradition, right? Like, all right, before we start modeling this data, let's look at the data and let's find a way to look at it. And,
right.
And I've learned a lot. I wish I could have learned more, but I've learned a lot from statistics in that vein, right? You've got to sort of look at the data before you decide how you're going to tackle it. Whereas, as economists, we do still think in sort of identification terms, right? All right, this isn't the identifying assumption. That implies this estimator, so let's go, right?
Right.
I understand the importance of that way of thinking about it as well.
Yeah.
But I think in good applied work, there is some room for both of those, right? That yes, even if I have a fundamental identification strategy that I believe is credible, I think it's not going to be a waste of my time to look at my data before I pull the trigger on what it is that I'm going to do.
I know.
in terms of whether it is causal or not, I think it really always has to come back to the situation you're looking at and what assumptions are believable.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, there are some situations in which people are assigned into a treatment or exposed to a policy based on covariates, right? Like,
Yep.
somebody had to decide. They were given, and like, I'm sitting in an office. I've got a stack of 15,000 files in front of me, and I've got to sort them out left and right, and just based on what's in the file. So, there are more than a few situations like that, but there are
Yep.
more than a few situations that are not like that, right?
Yeah.
And
Right.
I think this is perfectly fine, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah.
a student, a confession I always make to my students when I'm talking about regression discontinuity is I remember seeing Wilbert van der Klauw present the first RD paper when I was a graduate student.
Yeah.
I've forgotten the year, but it must have been right around then too, right? Like maybe 95. It's got to be around
Yeah.
that time,
Right. Right.
right? And so I remember thinking, okay, this is really nice, but this isn't really very applicable, is it? Right? Like, how often are you going to have the situation where, it's just set up exactly in this way that you have this discontinuity? Of course, I was wrong.
That's right.
I was
Exactly.
absolutely wrong.
Famous last words.
Famous last words. But I would say that there are likewise, there are some situations in which yes, you might
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah, this could be causal because this is the way that people were assigned, and we really believe that only these covariates determine which way you went in that assignment.
But that's a really good point. I mean, I think like that's where for me, propensity scores and selection on observables of all the methods, really, it's the one that reminds me how important it is that we're experts in the area that we're studying. It's like you've got to be, it's like you can sort of like take like natural experiment approaches and diff and diffs and stuff. And like, you can just kind of be almost kind of like, here's an event, I'm going to do this thing. But in some ways it's like, okay, well, the propensity scores might be appropriate, might not be. It really does depend on, do I really have a good understanding about why these units got into the treatment? That of course is always true, but it's like, it's like in your face a little bit with selection on observables.
Exactly. And even that way of thinking about it, right? That what determines assignment of treatment, it all goes back to that same potential outcomes world. When you start thinking about these things in that way, it just jumps out at you. It was all. I'm not saying that they invent. Not saying that that's where it was invented.
Yeah.
When you think about it that way, it just becomes so transparent, right?
It's yeah. Well, so let me conclude here. So we didn't get to really talk about Professor Embens very much, but I mean, what would you say was sort of the rewarding part of just getting to learn from him at that time of your career?
It was an incredible opportunity. So I think that first and foremost, there are a lot of things to say, but first and foremost, and I only appreciated this in some ways ex post because these are the people who I knew. But the fact that somebody who's a really highbrow econometrician was interested in speaking with someone like me who was not necessarily heading down that path, right? So let's just start there, right? So he became one of my principal advisors. That reflects something about him and his interests and his approach. And of course, now that I have a bigger picture of what he's done, right? Sometimes as a graduate student, you also see your advisors from a particular angle, usually looking up at them, right? And so you kind of just see them in a certain way. If you sort of see the totality of what Hito has done, that spirit has also motivated his own work, right? That he's somebody who's done econometrics, but has pursued questions that are important to people in the world, not just to prove a theorem because you can prove it, but because this is an important question.
Yeah.
And hence, so if I look back on it, I guess it makes sense that he was willing to work with me. But it was a great fortune for me that he was. I think Hito was also, and Gary as well, but in very different ways. They were incredibly available and hands-on advisors, right? That they both had different ways of working, but I sort of use them both as sort of role models when I'm dealing with my own graduate students, right? That we all get busy, and they must have been really busy as well, right? But they did find the time to give very careful and thoughtful advice and really sort of push in key directions at the right moment. And so I think that was a great fortune. And last but not least, I would say, and I think this is, of course, to some extent true of advisors, but not all of them, right? I think that also when you're done, you sort of realize that you are sort of part of an intellectual family, right? And I think that that shows when, unfortunately, Gary Chamberlain died fairly recently, right? It's a number of his former students had a chance to come together, celebrate him in different ways. And yes, we all did very different things, but you do sort of see that, we were using this phrase earlier, intellectual lineage, right? That, you do sort of see that connection. And likewise, with Tito, you also see that, as well. And so I do think from the very beginning, from even before I joined graduate school, when I was in college or in high school, to the present day, I do feel very fortunate for the luck to have run into a set of individuals that were incredible advisors in different ways, to have been in environments that were ripe with ideas, and to be able to run with them. I guess that took a little bit of skill and hard work as well, but it also took just the luck of being there.
Yeah, that's great. Well, it's been a real pleasure to get to talk in person, and I really have loved learning more about your career and about this this work that you did in graduate school. I know we didn't really leave graduate school, but it's been really nice to learn more of the stories behind that time in your life.
Thank you, Scott. It's been really a fun conversation. It's always nice to have the chance to sort of reminisce about these things, but to reminisce about them with someone who is deeply knowledgeable about the area, is very much interested in it, and sort of, for whom, like for me, these sort of events are events in our own intellectual history and in our little world.
Yeah.
Like these are really cool things and cool moments, and it's really a pleasure to get a chance to talk with somebody who clearly has the same sort of pleasure and appreciation for these moments in our intellectual progress.
Yeah. Well, I love it. I love your work too. And those two papers I'll be that you wrote with Dr. Wahba, I will be reading them and assigning them for a long time. So it's really neat to talk.
Thank you so much, Scott.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.